Section 2 of Chapter 5. And in this section, we look at energy and how the cell uses energy. We'll begin with the vocabulary. Kinetic energy is the energy of motion. I think everyone has seen kinetic energy at some point. If you saw a driving car, if you saw somebody running, if you saw a bird in flight, anytime you saw anything in motion, an object falling from a table, for example, all of these have been examples of kinetic energy. In every single case, something was in motion. Potential energy, on the other hand, is the energy that is stored. The fuel in your vehicle is an example of potential energy. The calories in a slice of pizza are examples of potential energy. If you have a little bit of a love handle, the love handles are some fat stores, and those represent potential energy. Some of us got a little bit more potential energy than others. But overall potential energy comes by way of chemical energy. Potential energy for a cell is usually stored in the form of a chemical. And in fact, every example I gave you was chemical energy. Okay, so I don't find those two terms to be too terribly complicated. But if you need help, let me know. The other thing I want to talk about is the laws of thermodynamics. There's a couple that I want you to know about. The first law states that energy cannot be created or destroyed. The only thing you can do with energy is convert it from one form into another. So, for example, potential energy oftentimes gets converted into kinetic energy. If I'm feeling fatigued and I eat something that is rich in calories, all of a sudden I got a little bit more energy, and I can put that energy into use by way of motion. So that's the first law, all right? So let's call it the law of conservation of energy. Law of conservation of energy. Big E, that means energy from here on out. The second law is the law of entropy. So what is entropy? Entropy is just a fancy way of saying disorder. And what this law says is that there is a natural tendency for things to head towards disorder. There's a natural tendency for things to fall apart and for energy to go from high energy to low energy. All right. So every time you convert energy from one form into another, anytime you exercise the first law of thermodynamics, the law of conservation of energy, some energy is always lost in the form of heat. And that would be an example of entropy. So all this energy is stored in one form, but when you pull the energy out and you use it for motion, some of that energy is lost as heat, and now that energy is kind of randomly being broken up into a variety of forms: kinetic energy and the energy of heat, which is also an example of kinetic energy. It's just one of those things you don't really see, but you kind of sense. So an example would be anytime you charge a phone, for example, the conversion of energy into your phone usually results in your phone or the adapter that you're using to plug into the electrical socket gets warm. And that's an example of heat energy that's being lost as you convert energy from one form into another. Okay, let's look at some examples from your textbook. Your car, for example, uses fuel, something called gasoline, and it also uses oxygen. And your engine takes the fuel, takes the oxygen, and in a combustion reaction, turns that energy, that potential energy, into the energy of motion. And now your vehicle represents kinetic energy. But notice also that your vehicle gets warm, right? That would be the loss of energy in the form of heat. This would be the example of entropy. Again, things are naturally heading towards disorder. It took a lot of energy to build the pyramids, but without any more energy investment, those pyramids are currently breaking down, right? In the case of your car, the fuel and the oxygen not only moved the vehicle, heated up the vehicle, but your vehicle also produced carbon dioxide and water as a waste product. Interestingly, our cells also use a chemical fuel, not gasoline, of course, but we use an energy storing molecule called glucose and still oxygen And then we perform all these cellular reactions that release energy as we convert this energy form into a different energy form called ATP. So the real reason why we eat foods of any kind containing carbs, lipids, proteins is really so that we can make this molecule right here, ATP. This is like money for the cell. If you've got ATP, you get to do stuff. If you don't have ATP, you sit down. And just like a car, we also produce a waste product, and the waste product happens to be carbon dioxide as well as water. Interestingly, the same exact waste products as a vehicle. Okay, so let's add to our understanding of reactions. So I'm going to outline a couple of reactions that I need you to really know. At this point, you have heard of dehydration synthesis. This was from Unit 1. And you've also heard of hydrolysis, also from Unit 1. Remember that dehydration synthesis was a building reaction and hydrolysis was a breakdown reaction, right? Okay, so here's the reactions that I want you to know about now. Let's go back and let's erase some of this stuff. Clear up the screen. Ooh, bougie stuff. All right, so here's the first reaction I want you to know about. Let's pretend that I've got a molecule consisting of 5 carbons, and I'd like to add another carbon to it. Okay, I'm making this as simple as possible. The end result is that I'm going to create a 6-carbon molecule. Is that 6? Yep. Okay. Well, what kind of reaction is this if I'm going to build something up? Well, you should recognize this sort of as dehydration synthesis. I realize that there's no water forming here or anything like that, but still, it's a building reaction, so it would be dehydration synthesis. I just happen to have left out all of the alcohols and the hydrogens that are pulled together to form water. Okay, but in order to build this 6-carbon molecule from a 5-carbon molecule plus 1, I need energy. So energy needed to be invested to build this thing. In fact, anytime you build something, you need energy. If you want to build a brick wall, you're going to need to invest energy. Okay, so this kind of reaction is also considered to be endergonic. It's endergonic because, as the term implies, energy had to be invested into this reaction. Okay, on the other hand, we could take a 6-carbon molecule and we can break it down into a 5-carbon molecule with a carbon dropped off, and it would be the exact opposite of reaction number 1. This would be like hydrolysis, right? It's a breakdown reaction, and it would also be considered exergonic. That means energy was released. Okay, so I realize that this is super simplified logic, but here's what I wanted to drive home with these 2 reactions. I wanted you to understand where chemicals store their energy. So in reaction number 1, if you go from 5 carbons to 6 carbons and energy is invested, that means that the 6-carbon molecule over here has more energy than the 5-carbon molecule. The question now is, where is that energy stored? And the answer is, energy is stored in bonds. Again, I realize the simplicity of this analogy or this model. But the point is that chemicals store their energy in bonds. So let's count the bonds. This one has 1, 2, 3, 4 bonds. But this one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bonds. The energy that makes this 6-carbon molecule greater in energy is stored in that 5th bond right there. Okay, let's look at reaction 2. In this case, you have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbon molecule, and you broke it down, so you released some of that energy. So let's count the bonds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bonds here, but on the other side, you have 1, 2, 3, 4 bonds. And that one bond has been broken. You can see it here in the form of a free carbon. Okay, so what is the major idea I'm trying to drive home? Energy, potential energy of chemicals is stored in bonds. All right, so let's remember that moving forward. Okay, so let's recapture the vocabulary we just applied there. Exergonic reactions are reactions that release energy. Energonic reactions require energy, and they give you products that are rich in potential energy. They have more energy. And remember where that energy is stored? It's stored in chemical bonds. Okay? So a cell is constantly creating bonds, breaking bonds, and the sum of all of those endergonic and exergonic reactions is what we generally term your metabolism. Okay, let's look at these reactions now in a graphical form. So let's first understand this graph. This graph is showing us the reaction in that direction and the energy scale on the y-axis, right? So the x-axis has the reaction, and the y-axis has the energy scale. And you can see that the potential energy is great for the reactants, right? They have a lot of potential energy, and the products now have less energy. So how do reactants go from high energy to low energy? Well, they must have released the energy, right? And so here's that energy being released. What kind of reaction is this? If a reaction has just lost energy, it would have to be exergonic. So what are examples of exergonic reactions that you're familiar with? That's anytime you take food and you break it down so that you could engage in some sort of kinetic activity. This would be an example of an exergonic reaction. And by the way, whenever you're engaged in kinetic activity, don't you have a tendency to get a little bit warm? That would be an example of heat production. And that would be another example of entropy. Okay, here's another reaction. In this case, the reactants start out with less energy. The products have more energy. Remember, the y-axis is showing the energy scale. And we can see energy going into the reactants so that the products are now with a rich amount of energy. So this would be an endergonic reaction. So when is it that we participate in endergonic reactions? Well, whenever you store fat or whenever you store glycogen. Remember, glycogen is the animal version of starch. Or when plants create starch. These are energy-rich molecules, and they were made by assembling things like glucose with another glucose to create a disaccharide or a trisaccharide, or eventually examples of what we've been calling polysaccharides. All right, ran out of space. Okay, but again, these are endergonic reactions, all right? Endergonic reactions build molecules that have a lot of energy. Exergonic reactions do the opposite. They take high energy molecules like starch and glycogen and they break them down into smaller molecules like glucose, which have less energy. All right, so now we get to ATP. ATP, what is it? What does it stand for? So as I mentioned earlier, ATP is an energy molecule, and it stands for adenosine triphosphate. And you are familiar with this functional group, the phosphate group. And what we're saying is that there's a molecule called adenosine that has 3, that's what the tri stands for. It's got 3 phosphates attached to it. And ATP is the energy molecule that the cell prefers to carry out all of its important endergonic reactions, or maybe to power up something like the sodium-potassium pump that we saw in the previous section of chapter 5, right? We saw active transport using energy in the form of ATP. So let's see what ATP looks like. So here's adenosine, right? Which is a nucleotide, by the way, the sort of thing that you find in DNA, A, T's, C's, and G's, right? Adenosine is a nucleotide, but it has 3 phosphates attached to it. And where are the energy, or where is the energy stored in this molecule? It's stored in 1, 2, those 3 bonds, right? So right now it's got a lot of energy. And if you do a hydrolysis reaction, right, here's water going into the reaction. This is, again, something we learned in our first unit. Then the product is going to be adenosine with how many phosphates now? 1, 2, and see that that bond has been broken, and that means that the energy has been released because the bond that stored the energy has been broken, and now a phosphate is left by itself. So ATP turns into ADP and a phosphate with energy that can be used to drive all kinds of things. Sodium potassium pumps, muscle activity, you name it, right? Anything that the cell needs energy for, those things need to be powered up with ATP. All right, so if we reverse this, right? If we reverse this, we can regenerate ATP. So we're going to talk about that when we discuss things like cellular respiration. All right, so let's practice some more here. What would this graph look like? What are the reactants versus the products, right? In terms of energy. So the reactant is ATP, and the product is all of this, ADP, phosphate, and energy. So does the reactant have more or less energy? Well, the reactant has a lot of energy, and after releasing its energy, the products have less energy. So what kind of reaction would we say this is? If it's releasing energy, we would say it's exergonic, right? And what term is now linked to exergonic? Hydrolysis. So hydrolysis is an energy-releasing type of reaction, whereas dehydration synthesis is endergonic, right? That's an energy-requiring process. Okay, so here's all the examples of how ATP can be used. It can be used for chemical work, right? Here's the reactants. They need energy to stick together, and if you release that phosphate, you can achieve a sticking together. You can use ATP to power up an active transport mechanism like the sodium potassium pump, or you can use it to get muscles to contract. Every one of these were examples of energy requiring processes. All right, this is an important slide here because it sort of summarizes how ATP can become ADP, releasing energy in a hydrolytic reaction, right? This would be exergonic. But you can also link ADP and phosphate to regenerate ATP, but that would require energy. That would be an endergonic process, and that would require dehydration synthesis, right? So I want you to link these terms together, right? Anytime you see breakdown of anything, energy should be released. Anytime you see the building of something through dehydration synthesis, that means you require energy. That's pretty much it.